The fountain pen didn't break when my brother held it up to the light, but something inside me did. Daniel smiled at the gathered crowd of education consultants and university donors, his voice smooth as silk. "My sister Rebecca tutors high schoolers now," he said, just loud enough for the room to hear. The academic world wasn't really her speed. Polite laughter rippled through the reception hall, soft and cutting. I stood near the refreshment table, holding a tray of programs I'd been asked to distribute, feeling my chest tighten with each breath. No one in that gleaming room knew I'd once developed a translation methodology that could have changed how we understand ancient texts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. No one knew that the research my brother built his entire career on had come from my notebooks, my late nights, my years of work. And no one knew he was the one who made sure I'd never be able to prove it. I watched him there, my brother, my thief, turning Professor Whitmore's fountain pen between his fingers like a trophy, and I thought about how close I was to breaking my silence. That evening I didn't confront him. I stayed quiet, hands steady, because I knew something he didn't. The letter in my apartment, the one with the Oxford University seal, the one asking about my availability for a very particular phone call, told me that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deep you bury it. I just had to wait for the right moment, the moment when I could say the words that would make every single person in that room understand exactly who had been lying all along. The morning routine in Portland never changed much. Rain tapped against the windows of the Learning Hub Tutoring Center with the same gentle insistence it had for the past 4 years. Inside, the smell of budget coffee mixed with the sound of teenagers flipping through SAT prep books and sighing over vocabulary words they'd forget by graduation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional beige that made time feel slower than it actually moved. I used to work in different rooms where the lighting was softer and the conversations were about ideas that mattered, about research that could shift understanding, about discoveries that made your hands shake when you first saw the data come together. I used to annotate manuscripts that were hundreds of years old, comparing grammatical structures across dead languages, finding patterns that revealed how people thought and communicated across centuries. Those rooms had tall windows and the kind of silence that felt sacred, where every footstep on hardwood floors seemed to echo with purpose. Now I worked with 16-year-olds who thought Mesopotamia was a type of pasta and couldn't tell you the difference between Greek and Latin if their college applications depended on it, which they often did. My office was really just a corner desk separated from the main tutoring floor by a partial wall that didn't reach the ceiling. On that desk sat a cup full of red pens, a stack of practice tests, and a single framed photograph of Professor Margaret Whitmore on the day she'd handed me my doctorate. Her eyes were bright in that picture, proud and fierce, the way they'd been before the cancer took that light away. Next to the frame, almost hidden behind a stack of grammar workbooks, was the letter. I'd read it so many times in the past week that I could recite it from memory, but I still pulled it out sometimes just to make sure the words hadn't changed. The paper was heavy, expensive, cream-colored with a watermark you could only see when you held it up to the light. The Oxford crest sat at the top, dignified and ancient, and below it, in precise professional language, was an inquiry about my current research status and availability for a confidential discussion regarding a faculty position. The thing about working with teenagers preparing for standardized tests is that they don't really see you as a person. You're just an obstacle between them and a score, a necessity their parents pay for, someone who exists only in the context of their needs. So when the door chimed and my brother Daniel walked in that Tuesday morning, none of the students looked up. They didn't recognize him even though his face had been in Education Week and the Chronicle of Higher Education, even though his consulting firm had worked with half the school districts in the Pacific Northwest. He wore what he always wore now, an expensive suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, shoes polished to a mirror shine, and carrying himself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to question whether you deserve your success. On his wrist, catching the overhead light, was the vintage Montblanc watch that had belonged to our father. On his lapel was a pin from the National Education Association. And clipped to his shirt pocket, visible even from across the room, was Professor Whitmore's fountain pen. He'd taken it from her office 3 days after her funeral, claimed she'd promised it to him during one of their consultations, though I'd been the one sitting by her bedside every evening for 6 months and never once heard her mention his name. That pen had written every note of feedback on my dissertation. It had signed the letter recommending me for the postdoctoral fellowship at Cambridge. It had marked up the margins of the research paper that became the foundation of everything that came after, my research paper, my methodology, my work, published under his name while I was still processing grief and hadn't yet realized what he'd done. Daniel didn't approach my desk directly. He made a show of looking around first, taking in the space with the kind of expression people use when they're trying to appear sympathetic but are actually cataloging evidence of your failure. A girl in the corner struggled with a geometry problem. 2 boys near the window were supposed to be doing reading comprehension, but were actually watching something on a phone, hidden under their textbook. The coffee maker gurgled as it finished another pot of the cheap blend that tasted like burnt toast. He let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable before he finally walked over. "Becca," he said, and his voice had that tone, the one that sounded warm on the surface but had an edge underneath like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I was in the neighborhood for a meeting and thought I'd stop by. See how you're doing." He glanced at the stack of practice tests on my desk, at the poster on the wall behind me that showed the difference between there, and there in bright cartoon letters meant for children. "This seems like good work. Important work. Not everyone is cut out for university research. There's no shame in finding your level." I set down the test I'd been grading, a multiple-choice section where a student had somehow gotten every single question wrong despite the fact that the answers followed an obvious pattern. My hand didn't shake. I'd learned a long time ago how to keep my body still even when everything inside me wanted to react. "Is there something you need, Daniel?" I asked. "Or did you just come here to remind me that you're successful and I'm not?" He laughed, the kind of laugh that was meant to defuse tension while actually creating more of it. "Don't be defensive. I actually came to invite you to something. There's an international education summit happening in Cambridge next month. My firm is one of the primary sponsors. I thought you might want to attend, maybe network a little, see if there are any opportunities." He pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on my desk, right on top of the test I'd been grading. "I can get you a pass. You'd have to help with registration or program distribution, but you'd be in the room. That counts for something." The card was thick, professionally printed, with his name in raised letters and about 6 different titles listed beneath it. Founder, Senior Consultant, Research Director. All built on work I'd done, on ideas I'd developed, on a methodology he'd stolen and claimed as his own while I was too devastated by Professor Whitmore's death to fight back properly. By the time I'd gathered myself enough to challenge him, he'd already published, already given keynote speeches, already built relationships with journal editors and university administrators, who found it much easier to believe that the charismatic consultant with the pedigree was the real innovator rather than his quieter sister who'd retreated to tutoring after a supposed academic scandal. "I'll think about it," I said, which we both knew meant no. He smiled anyway, that practice smile he used in promotional videos and conference presentations, the one that made people trust him even when they shouldn't. He tapped the business card twice with his index finger, a gesture that was somehow both casual and condescending, and then he left without saying goodbye. The door chimed again as it closed behind him. The students kept working, oblivious to the fact that anything had happened at all. I picked up his business card, turned it over in my fingers, and then dropped it into the trash can beside my desk. But even as I did, I felt the weight of the Oxford letter in the drawer below, and I wondered if maybe, just maybe, Cambridge wasn't such a bad idea after all. That night, after I'd locked up the tutoring center and made the drive back to my apartment in the rain, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside me. The apartment was small, the kind of place that real estate listings called cozy when they meant cramped, with walls thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television through the plaster, and a radiator that clanked whenever the heat kicked on. It was nothing like the faculty housing I'd briefly had in Boston, back when I was a visiting researcher with an office that overlooked the quad and bookshelves that reached the ceiling. This place had a kitchenette, a bathroom where the shower pressure was more suggestion than reality, and a main room that served as bedroom, living room, and office all at once. But it was mine, paid for with my own work, and there was something to be said for that even if the work itself felt small most days. I opened my email and scrolled through the usual accumulation of spam and automated reminders until I found the one I'd been looking for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The subject line read simply Confidential Inquiry, and the sender was listed as Dean Harold Blackwell, Academic Affairs, Oxford University. I'd already read it a dozen times, but I read it again anyway, letting each word sink in as though repetition could somehow make it more real. The email explained that Oxford was in the process of establishing a new endowed chair position in historical linguistics and translation methodology, and that my name had come up during their preliminary research. They'd reviewed my early publications, the ones from before everything fell apart, and they were interested in discussing my current work and future research plans. The email was careful not to promise anything, but the implication was clear enough. This wasn't just a courtesy inquiry. This was the kind of thing that could change everything. At the bottom of the email was a note that seemed almost casual, though I knew better than to think anything in academic correspondence was truly casual. Dean Blackwell mentioned that he'd be attending the International Education Summit in Cambridge, and wondered if I might be available for a brief informal conversation while he was in the area. No pressure, the email assured me, just a chance to discuss the position in person if I happened to be nearby. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Someone had known about the summit. Someone had made sure this invitation arrived exactly when it did. I thought about Daniel's visit, about his offer to get me into the event as support staff, and something cold settled in my chest. He had no idea what was actually happening. He thought he was being generous, giving his failed sister a chance to see what success looked like up close. He didn't know that while he was planning to parade his stolen achievements in front of colleagues and administrators, I'd be in the same building having a conversation that could restore everything he'd taken from me. I pulled out my phone and opened the contact list, scrolling until I found Kevin Park's number. Kevin and I had overlapped during my time at Boston University. He'd been in the computer science department while I was in linguistics, but we both worked late nights in the library and had developed the kind of friendship that forms between people who are too tired to maintain social pretenses. After everything happened, after the accusations and the investigation and the quiet suggestion that I resign rather than face a formal hearing, Kevin had been one of the few people who'd believed me when I said the research was mine. He'd also been one of the few people with the technical skills to help me prove it, though by the time we'd started looking into it seriously, Daniel had already established himself as the methodology's creator, and any accusation I made just looked like sour grapes from a disgraced researcher. The phone rang 3 times before Kevin answered. His voice was groggy, and I realized too late that it was nearly midnight on the East Coast. "Becca? Everything okay?" There was genuine concern in his voice, the kind that made me remember why I'd called him in the first place, why he was one of maybe 3 people in the world I actually trusted anymore. "I need your help," I said. "And I need you to not ask too many questions until I can explain everything properly." There was a pause, the sound of rustling fabric like he was sitting up in bed, and then his voice came back clearer, more alert. "What do you need?" I told him about the Oxford inquiry, about Daniel's visit, about the summit in Cambridge. I told him that I thought this was finally the chance I'd been waiting for, the moment when I could stop hiding and start proving what had really happened 4 years ago. And then I told him what I needed him to do, the kind of favor that went beyond friendship into the territory of risk, the kind of thing that could get him in trouble if anyone found out he was helping me. When I finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. Then Kevin exhaled slowly and said, "Send me the details. I'll see what I can do." The next 3 weeks passed in a strange kind of suspension, where time seemed to move both too quickly and too slowly at once. My days at the tutoring center continued with their usual rhythm of frustrated teenagers and endless practice tests. But underneath the surface routine, I was preparing for something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Kevin called me every few days with updates, his voice carefully neutral in case anyone was listening, though I doubted anyone cared enough about a tutoring center employee to monitor her phone calls. He'd managed to access the archived server logs from Boston University's research database, the ones that track document creation and modification timestamps. It had taken some creative problem solving and a few favors from people who still owed him from his time working in their IT department, but he'd found what we needed. The original files of my translation methodology research, complete with metadata showing that I'd created them 18 months before Daniel's published paper, appeared in the Journal of Applied Linguistics. The evidence was technical, the kind of thing that required understanding how academic databases tracked revisions and stored backup files, but it was also undeniable. Kevin had compiled everything into a secure folder, that I could access from any computer with the right credentials. He'd also done something else, something I hadn't asked for but was grateful for nonetheless. He'd tracked down 3 former graduate students who'd been working in the linguistics department during my time there, people who'd seen me presenting early versions of the methodology in departmental seminars, who'd asked questions and offered suggestions that had helped me refine the approach. Their testimony wouldn't be enough on its own, but combined with the server logs and the archived emails showing my correspondence with Professor Whitmore about the research, it painted a picture that would be very difficult for Daniel to explain away. I spent my evenings after work going through everything Kevin sent me, checking and rechecking the timeline, making sure I understood not just what had happened but how to explain it clearly and convincingly. The story was actually quite simple once you stripped away all the technical details. I'd developed a new approach to analyzing grammatical patterns in ancient texts, one that used computational methods to identify translation inconsistencies that human readers might miss. The methodology had applications in biblical studies, classical literature, historical linguistics, any field where understanding old texts mattered. Professor Whitmore had been enthusiastic about the work, had encouraged me to develop it into a series of papers that could establish my reputation in the field. But then she'd gotten sick, and everything had slowed down while I spent more time at the hospital than at my desk. Daniel had visited Professor Whitmore a few times during those last months. He told me he wanted to pay his respects, that despite their professional differences he'd always admired her work. I'd thought it was generous of him, had even been touched that my brother was making an effort to support me during such a difficult time. I hadn't known he was also accessing my research files from Professor Whitmore's computer, the one I'd used during my visits because it had better processing power than my laptop. I hadn't known he was photographing my notebooks during the one weekend I'd left them in her office while I went home to sleep for the first time in 72 hours. And I definitely hadn't known that he was already in conversation with Dr. Preston Vale, the editor of the Journal of Applied Linguistics, about a groundbreaking new paper on translation methodology that would revolutionize the field. The paper appeared 6 weeks after Professor Whitmore's funeral. I was still in that fog of grief where everything felt distant and unreal, where I moved through days without fully registering what was happening around me. A colleague forwarded me the journal link with a message that said, "Hey, isn't this similar to what you were working on?" I'd opened the PDF with curiosity, expecting to see something adjacent to my research, maybe someone who'd had a parallel idea and beaten me to publication. What I found instead was my own work, my exact methodology, my specific examples, even some of the same phrasing I'd used in my draft notes, all published under Daniel Foster's name with no mention of me anywhere in the paper. I called him immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. He'd answered on the 3rd ring, his voice cheerful and unsuspecting, and I'd asked him to explain what I was looking at. There had been a pause, just a brief hesitation, and then his tone had shifted into something I'd never quite heard from him before. He told me that the research was his, that he'd been developing these ideas for years, and that any similarity to my work was either coincidence or the result of conversations we'd had where he'd shared his thinking with me. When I protested, when I told him I had drafts and notes and emails that proved the work was mine, he'd said something that made my blood run cold. He told me that Professor Whitmore had consulted with him extensively on the methodology, that she'd actually suggested he take the lead on publication because his name would carry more weight in the field, and that if I tried to challenge him on this, I'd be disrespecting her memory and her final wishes. It was a masterful lie, the kind that was almost impossible to disprove because the one person who could contradict it was dead. I tried anyway, had filed a formal complaint with the university's Research Integrity Office, had submitted my drafts and notes and the email correspondence I'd saved. The investigation had lasted 3 months, during which Daniel hired a lawyer and Dr. Preston Vale issued a statement defending the journal's peer review process. In the end, the committee had found the evidence inconclusive. They acknowledged that I'd been working on similar ideas, but they couldn't definitively prove that Daniel's paper was derived from my work rather than being parallel research. The committee chair had actually praised us both for contributing to an important methodological conversation, as though this was a collegial disagreement rather than theft. But then things had gotten worse. 2 weeks after the investigation concluded, someone leaked a story to an academic blog that specialized in research misconduct. The post claimed that I'd fabricated data in my graduate work, That Professor Whitmore had discovered the fabrication shortly before her death, and that the stress of deciding how to handle the situation had contributed to the decline in her health. The story was false, completely and demonstrably false, but it spread quickly through academic circles the way scandalous stories always do. The blog post disappeared after a few days, removed by moderators once people started questioning its sourcing. But the damage was done. My name was now associated with words like fabrication and misconduct and ethical violations. When my visiting researcher contract came up for renewal, Boston University quietly declined to extend it. No one would say explicitly that it was because of the rumors, but everyone understood. I'd thought about fighting harder, about hiring my own lawyer or going to the press, but I was exhausted and grieving and increasingly aware that I was up against someone who had resources and connections I couldn't match. Daniel's consulting firm was growing rapidly, bringing in contracts with major school districts and education nonprofits. He was becoming a name people recognized, someone who got invited to keynote conferences and advise policymakers. I was becoming the bitter sister who couldn't accept that her brother had succeeded where she'd failed. So I'd stopped fighting. I'd taken the job at the tutoring center in Portland, about as far from Boston as I could get without leaving the country entirely, and I tried to build something that resembled a life. The tutoring work was fine, nothing more and nothing less than that. The kids were mostly decent once you got past their teenage conviction that nothing mattered and everything was stupid. Some of them were even bright, showing flashes of real curiosity when you could get them to look up from their phones long enough to engage with an idea. I'd helped a girl named Sophie improve her SAT reading score by 200 points. Watched her face light up when she got her acceptance letter from her dream school. I'd worked with a boy named Marcus who'd been convinced he was bad at languages until I showed him the patterns, the way grammar was really just a system of logical relationships, and suddenly Latin made sense to him in a way it never had before. These were small victories, but they were real, and there were moments when I could almost convince myself that this work mattered as much as the research I'd lost. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet and I couldn't sleep, I'd think about Daniel standing in front of audiences I should have been addressing, writing papers that built on ideas I'd developed, shaping a field I'd once dreamed of contributing to. I'd think about Professor Whitmore, about how proud she'd been of my work, about how she'd told me once that I had the kind of mind that could change how people understood the past. And I'd wonder what she would think if she could see what had happened, if she'd believe Daniel's lie about her endorsing his theft, if she'd be disappointed that I'd given up the fight. The Oxford letter had changed something, though. It had reminded me that the work itself still existed, that the ideas I developed were still valid and valuable regardless of who'd gotten credit for them. And more than that, it had given me something I'd been missing for 4 years. A reason to believe that the truth might actually matter to someone. Dean Blackwell's email hadn't mentioned Daniel at all, had focused entirely on my early publications and my potential contributions to Oxford's new research initiative. Someone there had looked past the rumors and the scandal and seen what I was actually capable of. That meant something. That meant maybe the fight wasn't over after all. The invitation to the summit arrived by mail 2 weeks before the event. A formal printed card in a heavy envelope with my name spelled correctly, and a registration code that indicated I was listed as a guest rather than support staff. I hadn't accepted Daniel's offer to get me in as a program distributor, but apparently someone else had made sure I'd be there anyway. The card included a schedule of events and a note indicating that several sessions would focus on innovative research methodologies in education, with a special keynote from Dr. Preston Vale about maintaining integrity in academic publishing. The irony was so thick I actually laughed out loud when I read it. Kevin called that evening with final preparations. He'd arranged for me to have access to a secure network connection at the venue, something that would let me display the archived research files if the opportunity arose. He'd also contacted the 3 former graduate students, and 2 of them had agreed to attend the summit if I needed them to provide testimony. The third had declined, apologizing but explaining that she couldn't risk her current position by getting involved in what might become a public dispute. I understood. The academic world was small and vindictive, and people had long memories for those who made trouble. The night before I was supposed to fly to Boston, I pulled out the box I kept on the top shelf of my closet, the one I hadn't opened since moving to Portland. Inside were remnants of my previous life, my doctorate diploma still in its leather folder, a photo of me and Professor Whitmore at my dissertation defense, a name badge from my first academic conference, And at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a photocopy of a letter she'd written to me during the last weeks of her life. Her handwriting had been shaky by then, the cancer making it difficult to grip a pen, but the words were clear enough. She'd written about how proud she was of my work, how the translation methodology I'd developed had the potential to reshape the field, and how she hoped I'd continue pushing forward even after she was gone. She'd signed it with her characteristic flourish and added a postscript: "Don't let anyone diminish what you've built. The truth has weight and eventually weight wins." I'd forgotten about that letter, had packed it away with everything else from that period of my life, but seeing it now felt like a message across time. Professor Whitmore had known something I'd lost sight of in the years since her death. The truth did have weight, and if you could hold on long enough, if you could stay steady through the lies and the attacks and the moments when giving up seemed easier than fighting, eventually that weight would tip the balance. I refolded the letter carefully and placed it in my carry-on bag, next to the printed copies of Kevin's evidence files. Whatever happened at the summit, I wouldn't be going in empty-handed. And I wouldn't be going in as the person Daniel thought I was, the defeated sister who'd found her level distributing programs at events she wasn't qualified to actually participate in. I'd be going in as Dr. Rebecca Foster, the researcher who developed a methodology that apparently Oxford University thought was worth an endowed chair position. That person had been quiet for a long time, but she was still here and she was done hiding. The flight to Boston left Portland at 6 in the morning, which meant I was awake at 3:30, too anxious to sleep and too restless to stay in bed pretending I might. I made coffee in the dark kitchen, watching the city lights through my window and thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. Daniel had spent 4 years building his reputation on stolen work, cultivating relationships with people who mattered, positioning himself as an expert in a field he barely understood before he'd taken my research. He had money, influence, and the kind of confidence that came from never facing real consequences. I had server logs, archived emails, and the testimony of 2 graduate students who most people had never heard of. On paper, it wasn't a fair fight. But then again, nothing about this situation had ever been fair. The airport was mostly empty at that hour, just a handful of travelers moving through security with the glazed expressions of people who'd rather be sleeping. I bought a bottle of water I didn't drink and a breakfast sandwich I didn't eat, then sat at the gate watching the sky gradually lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gray that passed for morning in November. My phone buzzed with a message from Kevin asking if I'd landed yet, and I realized he'd forgotten about the time difference, that it was already mid-morning for him while I was still waiting to board. I sent back a quick reply telling him I'd message when I arrived, then turned my phone to airplane mode before I could second-guess anything else. The flight itself was unremarkable, the kind of travel experience that exists in a bubble outside normal time. I had a window seat and spent most of the journey staring at clouds, trying not to think too hard about what the next few days would bring. Somewhere over Montana or maybe Wyoming, the woman in the seat next to me asked what brought me to Boston, and I told her I was attending an education conference. She said that sounded interesting in the tone people use when they mean the exact opposite, then put in earbuds and didn't speak to me again for the rest of the flight. It was just as well. I wasn't sure I could have explained what I was really doing even if I'd wanted to, wasn't sure I fully understood it myself yet. Boston appeared below us as we descended, the city spread out in familiar patterns that I'd once known well enough to navigate without thinking. I'd lived here for 3 years during my postdoctoral work, had walked those streets and eaten in those restaurants and spent long evenings in libraries that felt like sanctuaries. Coming back felt strange, like visiting a place where you used to live in a dream, where everything was recognizable but slightly off, not quite matching your memories. The taxi from the airport took me through neighborhoods I'd once considered home, past Boston University's campus where I could see students moving between buildings with backpacks and coffee cups, completely unaware that someone who used to belong there was passing by as a stranger. The hotel Kevin had booked for me was in Cambridge, close enough to Harvard's campus that I could walk to the summit venue but far enough from the main conference hotel that I was unlikely to run into Daniel by accident. The room was small and clean, with a view of a parking lot and a bathroom where the shower made an alarming grinding noise when you turned it on. I dropped my bag on the bed and stood at the window for a moment, watching cars come and go below. Ordinary people doing ordinary things while I prepared for something that felt anything but ordinary. My phone showed 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize and a text message from Kevin that just said, "Call me when you can." Important. I called him back immediately, my pulse quickening at the urgency in his message. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Excitement, maybe, or nervousness, or some combination of both. He told me he'd received an email that morning from one of his contacts in academic publishing, someone who worked in the back-end systems that journals use to manage submissions and peer review. Apparently, there'd been some unusual activity in the Journal of Applied Linguistics database recently, someone accessing old submission records from around the time Daniel's paper was published. The activity had triggered an automatic security flag, because the person accessing the records was using administrator credentials that had supposedly been deactivated years ago. Kevin's contact had looked into it out of curiosity and discovered something interesting. The peer review records for Daniel's paper had been modified after publication, something that should have been impossible given how the journal's database was structured. Someone with high-level access had gone back and altered the reviewer comments, making them appear more enthusiastic than they'd originally been. It was a small change, the kind of thing no one would ever notice unless they were specifically looking for it, but it suggested that the paper's acceptance hadn't been as straightforward as Dr. Preston Vale had always claimed. More importantly, it suggested that someone had been worried enough about the paper's legitimacy to feel the need to retroactively improve its peer review record. Kevin said he didn't know yet who'd made the modifications or why they'd done it so long after publication, but he was working on tracing the access logs to find out. In the meantime, he wanted me to know that there was potentially more evidence of wrongdoing than just the theft of my research. If someone had tampered with the journal's database, that was a serious breach of academic integrity, the kind of thing that could call into question everything the journal had published during that period. I thanked him and promised to be careful, though I wasn't entirely sure what being careful meant in this context. I was already committed to confronting Daniel at the summit. Learning that he might have tampered with journal records didn't change my plans so much as confirm that I was right to make them. I spent the rest of that day preparing. I reviewed Kevin's files until I could recite the timeline from memory, until I knew exactly which document was created when and which email was sent to whom and what every piece of evidence proved. I practiced explaining the technical details in plain language, the kind of explanation that would make sense to people who weren't experts in database architecture or research methodology. I laid out the clothes I'd wear to the summit, a dark blue suit that I'd bought years ago for conference presentations and hadn't worn since leaving Boston. It still fit, though the woman who looked back at me from the hotel mirror seemed older than I remembered, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, hair that needed cutting, an expression that was harder and more guarded than it used to be. That evening I walked through Harvard's campus as the sun set and the temperature dropped. Students hurried past in groups, laughing and arguing and completely absorbed in their own dramas, the way students always are. I found myself standing outside the library where I'd spent so many hours during my postdoc, looking up at the windows that glowed warm yellow against the darkening sky. Someone else was sitting at the desk where I used to work, bent over books I couldn't see, living a version of the life I'd lost. I wondered if they knew how fragile it all was, how quickly it could be taken away if the wrong person decided you were a threat to their ambitions. Probably not. You never know those things until it's too late. I ate dinner alone at a small restaurant near the hotel. Nothing fancy, just pasta and a glass of wine that I barely touched. The place was full of people having normal conversations about normal things, weekend plans and work frustrations and somebody's upcoming birthday party. I sat in the corner with my phone, scrolling through the summit schedule and making notes about which sessions I needed to attend. Daniel was giving a presentation on the second day about innovative approaches to educational assessment, a topic that had nothing to do with the translation methodology he'd built his reputation on. Dr. Preston Vale's keynote on research integrity was scheduled for that same afternoon, right before the closing reception. It was almost poetic the way the timing had worked out. When I got back to the hotel, there was a message waiting for me at the front desk. The envelope was the same expensive cream-colored paper as the Oxford letter had been, and for a moment my heart stopped, thinking maybe they'd changed their minds, maybe someone had told them about the scandal and they were withdrawing their interest. But when I opened it in the elevator going up to my room, I found instead a brief handwritten note on Oxford letterhead. Dean Blackwell wrote that he'd arrived in Cambridge that evening, and wondered if I might be available for coffee the next morning before the summit officially began. He included his mobile number and a suggestion that we meet at a cafe near the hotel at 7:30 if that wasn't too early. I read the note 3 times, trying to decode what it meant. Coffee before the summit seemed casual, but nothing about an Oxford dean's schedule was actually casual. He was making time to see me privately before the official event started, which suggested this was more than a polite meet and greet. This was the conversation the email had hinted at, the discussion about research plans and future work that might determine whether the endowed chair position was a real possibility, or just a preliminary inquiry that wouldn't go anywhere. I set my alarm for 5:30 and tried to sleep, though my mind kept racing through possible conversations, imagining questions he might ask and answers I needed to have ready. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough, the way important days always do. I dressed carefully, opting for the same blue suit but with a different shirt, something that looked professional without trying too hard. I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early and ordered tea I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands while I waited. Dean Blackwell appeared exactly at 7:30, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair, and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent time outdoors despite decades in academia. He spotted me immediately, offered a firm handshake, and sat down across from me with a coffee that looked like it wasn't his first of the morning. He started with pleasantries, asking about my flight and whether I'd been to Cambridge recently, the kind of small talk that was meant to put people at ease. I answered politely but didn't elaborate, sensing that he was working up to something more substantial. After a few minutes, he set his coffee down and leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. He told me he'd been following my work for longer than I might realize, that he'd actually heard me present an early version of the translation methodology at a conference in London years ago, back when I was still a graduate student and he was just beginning his tenure as dean. He'd been impressed then by the rigor of the approach and the clarity of my thinking, and he'd made a mental note to watch for my future publications. When Daniel's paper came out instead, Dean Blackwell said he'd been confused at first, wondering if perhaps you'd been working together, if maybe this was a collaboration that just hadn't been clearly credited. But then he'd heard rumors about a dispute, about accusations and an investigation, and he'd followed the situation with interest even though he had no direct involvement. What he'd noticed, he said, was that my name disappeared from academic publishing after that incident, while Daniel's appeared with increasing frequency. It was a pattern he'd seen before in academia, where someone with power or connections could effectively erase someone else's contributions, and most people would simply accept the official narrative, rather than ask difficult questions. I didn't know what to say to that, wasn't sure if he was asking me to confirm his suspicions or just explaining why he'd reached out after all these years. He continued before I could formulate a response, telling me that Oxford's new endowed chair position was specifically designed to support scholars who'd made significant methodological contributions to their fields, but might not have received proper recognition for that work. They were looking for someone with genuine insight and original thinking, not just someone who'd published frequently or accumulated impressive credentials. When my name had come up during their preliminary research, he'd immediately remembered that conference presentation from years ago, and he'd decided to investigate further. What he'd found, he said, was that my early publications were exceptional, showing exactly the kind of innovative approach they wanted to foster at Oxford. He'd also found the controversy surrounding my departure from Boston University, the allegations of data fabrication that had never been formally proven, but had nonetheless damaged my reputation. He'd made some discreet inquiries among colleagues who'd known me during that time, and everyone he spoke to had been surprised by the accusations, describing me as meticulous and ethical, not someone who would fabricate research data. That had convinced him to reach out despite the potential complications, to at least have a conversation about whether I might be interested in returning to active research. I listened to all of this with a strange sense of unreality, as though I was hearing about someone else's life rather than my own. It had been so long since anyone in academia had taken my work seriously, had looked past the scandal to consider what I'd actually contributed, that I'd almost forgotten what that felt like. I told Dean Blackwell the truth, or at least the version of it I'd been carrying for 4 years. I explained how I developed the translation methodology, how Professor Whitmore had encouraged me to pursue it, how her death had left me vulnerable at exactly the moment when I needed to be most vigilant about protecting my work. I told him about Daniel's paper appearing in the journal, about my failed attempt to prove the research was mine, about the fabrication allegations that had surfaced right after I'd challenged his authorship. Dean Blackwell listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but attentive. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee even though he hadn't added anything to it. Then he said something that surprised me. He told me he believed me, not because he had any special insight into what had actually happened, but because the story I'd told matched patterns he'd seen play out many times in his decades in academia. Brilliant work gets stolen, usually by someone with more institutional power or better connections. The victim tries to fight back and discovers that institutions protect their interests, not truth. The victim's reputation gets destroyed to justify the theft, and everyone moves on as though justice was served when really it was just expedience. The question now, he said, was what I intended to do about it. Oxford couldn't offer me a position based on work that was publicly credited to someone else, no matter how convinced he personally might be about who really deserved credit. If I wanted the endowed chair, I'd need to find a way to reclaim my research, to establish clearly and publicly that the methodology was mine. He couldn't help me do that, couldn't get involved in what was essentially a dispute between two American researchers, but he could tell me that if I succeeded, if I could prove my authorship in a way that satisfied academic standards of evidence, Oxford would be very interested in continuing our conversation. I asked him what would happen if I couldn't prove it, if Daniel's version of events remained the official record. Dean Blackwell sighed, and for the first time he looked less like an administrator and more like someone who was genuinely disappointed by how academia worked. He said that in that case there wouldn't be much he could do. Oxford couldn't hire someone whose reputation was tainted by fabrication allegations, even if those allegations were false. The institution had to protect itself, had to maintain standards that couldn't be compromised by individual sympathy. He was sorry, he said, but that was the reality of the situation. I had a chance here, maybe the only chance I'd get, but I had to be the one to take it. No one was going to hand me justice. I had to claim it myself. The International Education Summit opened with the kind of orchestrated enthusiasm that academic conferences always tried to project, as though gathering hundreds of researchers and administrators in an overpriced hotel ballroom was inherently exciting rather than mildly exhausting. Registration tables lined the marble lobby, staffed by volunteers in matching polo shirts who handed out name badges and glossy program books thick enough to be weapons. The air smelled like expensive coffee, and the particular anxiety that comes from being in a room full of people trying to impress each other. I picked up my badge and noticed that it listed my affiliation as independent researcher, which was technically accurate and also somehow humiliating, a public acknowledgement that I belonged to no institution, claimed by nowhere and no one. The main ballroom had been set up with rows of chairs facing a stage where the morning keynote speakers would hold forth about innovation and excellence, and all the other words that sound meaningful until you hear them repeated enough times that they blur into noise. I found a seat near the back, close to the exit, and watched people file in with their coffee cups and their phones, forming clusters of conversation that would dissolve and reform throughout the day. Daniel wasn't hard to spot when he arrived. He'd always had a presence that drew attention, that made people want to be near him, and this morning was no different. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, his hair perfectly styled, Professor Whitmore's fountain pen visible in his breast pocket like a badge of legitimacy he'd stolen along with everything else. He was surrounded by a small group of people I recognized from their photos in the program. Dr. Preston Vale was there, looking distinguished in the way journal editors always tried to look, with his silver beard and wire-rimmed glasses and an expression of bemused superiority. There were two university provosts I didn't know personally but whose institutions I recognized, both major research universities with enough money and influence to matter. And there was someone I hadn't expected to see, a woman named Dr. Catherine Werner who ran the National Education Research Foundation, one of the largest funding agencies in the country. She was laughing at something Daniel had said, her hand resting briefly on his arm in the casual way people touch when they're comfortable with each other, when there's familiarity and trust. I watched this tableau from my seat in the back and felt something cold settle in my chest. These weren't just colleagues. These were Daniel's allies, people who'd invested in his success, and who therefore had a vested interest in maintaining the narrative that he was the brilliant innovator he claimed to be. If I challenged him publicly, I wouldn't just be fighting my brother. I'd be fighting everyone whose reputation was tied to his, everyone who'd endorsed his work or funded his research or published his papers. The institutional weight Dean Blackwell had talked about wasn't abstract. It was right there in that cluster of expensive suits and confident smiles, a wall of credibility that I'd have to break through with nothing but archived server logs and the testimony of graduate students no one had ever heard of. The morning sessions began with the usual parade of presentations, researchers describing their work in the stilted language of academic papers, speaking too quickly or too softly or reading directly from slides that contained too much text. I sat through a panel on assessment design that was competent but uninspiring, another on teacher training programs that all seemed to make the same basic points with different data sets. Between sessions I checked my phone compulsively, half hoping Kevin would send some breakthrough piece of evidence that would make everything easier, half dreading that he'd tell me the whole plan had fallen apart. But there were no messages, just the steady passage of time toward the afternoon when everything would either change or stay, exactly the same as it had been for 4 years. Lunch was served in a different ballroom, round tables with white tablecloths where people were meant to network and build connections that might turn into collaborations or job opportunities, or at minimum interesting conversations. I picked up a plate of food I didn't want and looked for an empty table, preferably one far from where Daniel was holding court near the windows. But before I could escape, someone called my name, and I turned to find Kevin walking toward me with a woman I didn't recognize. He'd flown in that morning from Boston, had told me he'd be at the summit, but I hadn't expected to see him until later. He introduced his companion as Dr. Lisa Chan, one of the graduate students who'd agreed to provide testimony about my work. She was younger than I'd expected, probably late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and an expression that suggested she was as nervous about being here as I was. We found a table in the corner and sat down, speaking quietly while people moved around us with their plates and their conversations. Lisa told me she remembered my seminar presentations clearly, remembered being impressed by the elegance of the methodology and the careful way I'd worked through potential objections during the Q&A sessions. She'd gone on to use some of my approaches in her own dissertation research, had cited my early work before Daniel's paper came out, and the whole situation became complicated. When she'd heard that I was planning to challenge his authorship, she'd felt obligated to speak up, to say publicly what she'd known privately for years. It was the right thing to do, she said, even though she was worried about what it might mean for her career to contradict someone as influential as Daniel had become. Kevin pulled out his laptop and showed us something he'd been working on. A visual timeline that displayed all the evidence in chronological order. It started with my first notes about the translation methodology, dated 2 years before Daniel's paper was published, and progressed through draft versions of the research, emails with Professor Whitmore, seminar presentations that Lisa and others had attended, all the way up to the suspicious modifications in the journal database that his contact had discovered. The timeline was color-coded and annotated, designed to be comprehensible even to people who didn't understand the technical details. It was, I had to admit, pretty damning if you looked at it objectively. The only question was whether anyone would be willing to look objectively when the alternative was to maintain comfortable assumptions about who was credible and who wasn't. We were still discussing strategy when I noticed Dr. Preston Vale approaching our table. He moved with the self-assurance of someone who'd never had his authority seriously questioned, stopping beside our table and smiling down at us like a benevolent dean greeting students at a university function. He greeted Kevin by name, which surprised me until I remembered that Kevin had done some consulting work for the journal's technical systems years ago. Then his eyes moved to me, and something flickered in his expression, recognition maybe, or calculation, some assessment happening behind his polite smile. He said it was good to see me again, that he'd heard I was working in education at a different level now, his tone making it clear that different level meant lower, less important, beneath the concern of people like him. I stood up, which forced him to take a small step back, disrupting whatever power dynamic he'd been trying to establish. I told him it was interesting that he'd mentioned hearing about my work, because I'd recently learned some interesting things about his journal's peer review process, about database modifications that shouldn't have been possible, about records being altered after publication in ways that raised questions about the integrity of everything the journal had published during his tenure as editor. His smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes went cold and sharp. He said that he had no idea what I was talking about, that the journal maintained the highest standards of integrity, and that making unfounded accusations was exactly the kind of behavior that had damaged my reputation in the first place. Before I could respond, Daniel appeared beside Preston, seemingly materializing out of the crowd with perfect timing. He put his hand on Preston's shoulder in a gesture that was both familiar and possessive, a physical declaration of alliance. He looked at me with an expression that might have been concern if you didn't know him well enough to see the threat underneath. He said that maybe we should talk privately, that this wasn't the place for whatever issue I seemed to be trying to raise, that he'd hate for me to embarrass myself in front of all these people who were important to the field. The paternalistic condescension in his voice was so thick I could barely breathe through it, but I kept my expression neutral, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how angry I was. I told him that actually this was exactly the place for the conversation we needed to have, that I was done hiding and done letting him profit from work he'd stolen. I told him I had evidence, documentation, testimony from people who'd seen me develop the methodology before he'd published it under his own name. I told him that I knew about the journal database modifications, about the peer review records that had been altered to make his paper look more legitimate than it had actually been. And I told him that if he wanted to avoid a very public scandal, he should consider acknowledging the truth before someone else forced him to. The conversations around us had started to quiet, people sensing conflict the way crowds always do, turning their attention toward our table even if they couldn't hear exactly what was being said. Daniel's expression shifted, the concerned brother mask slipping enough to show something harder underneath. He told me I was confused, that grief over Professor Whitmore's death had clearly affected my judgment, that he tried to be patient with me but there were limits to how much disruption he could tolerate. He said that if I continued making these accusations, he'd have no choice but to pursue legal action for defamation, and that unlike me, he had the resources to follow through on that threat. Kevin stood up then, his laptop still open on the table, the timeline visible on the screen. He said that maybe Daniel would like to explain why his paper contained phrases that were identical to passages in my draft documents that had been created months before his submission. He said that maybe Preston would like to explain why someone with his administrator credentials had accessed and modified peer review records 3 years after Daniel's paper was published. He said these things calmly, without raising his voice, but loud enough that the people at nearby tables could hear every word. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that feels like pressure building before a storm breaks. Preston's face had gone pale, and he started to say something about these being serious allegations that required investigation through proper channels, not public accusations at a professional conference. But before he could finish, Lisa stood up and said that she'd been at my seminar presentations, that she'd seen me develop this methodology in real time, and that she was willing to testify to that fact formally if necessary. And then from a table across the room, another voice joined hers. Dr. Marcus Webb, the second graduate student Kevin had contacted, was standing up and saying that he could corroborate everything Lisa had said, that he'd been in those seminars too and remembered them clearly. Daniel's confident expression was cracking now, uncertainty showing through the polished exterior. He looked at Preston, who looked back with an expression that suggested he was already calculating how to distance himself from whatever was about to happen. I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite triumph, wasn't quite vindication, but was maybe the beginning of both. I told Daniel that we could do this here and now in front of everyone, or we could do it later through formal channels that would be much more destructive to his reputation. I told him the choice was his, but either way the truth was coming out. Dr. Catherine Werner had approached while we were talking, drawn by the commotion like everyone else in the room. She stood at the edge of our cluster, listening with an expression I couldn't read. When there was a pause in the confrontation, she asked what exactly was being alleged here, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to getting answers. Kevin turned his laptop toward her and walked through the timeline, showing her each piece of evidence, explaining the significance of the timestamps and the database modifications and the testimony from multiple witnesses. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing progressively more serious as the presentation continued. When Kevin finished, she looked at Daniel for a long moment, then at Preston, then finally at me. She said that these were extremely serious allegations, that if they were true they represented not just theft but a systematic deception that had corrupted the academic record. She said that the National Education Research Foundation had funded 2 of Daniel's subsequent projects based in part on the strength of his initial methodology paper, and that if that paper's authorship was fraudulent, it called into question everything that had followed. She turned to Preston and asked point blank whether he'd modified journal records after publication. He started to deflect, to say that any administrative access to the database was routine maintenance, but she cut him off and told him that wasn't what she'd asked. The room had gone completely silent now. Dozens of people watching this confrontation unfold with the horrified fascination people have for public disasters. Preston looked at Daniel, who looked at the floor, and in that exchange of glances I saw the alliance crumbling, saw each of them realizing that protecting themselves mattered more than protecting each other. Preston said that he may have made some minor corrections to formatting in the database, that it was a technical issue not a substantive one, his voice lacking conviction. Catherine asked to see Kevin's evidence of the specific changes made, and when she reviewed them, her expression hardened into something that looked like genuine anger. She said that she'd need to review all of this formally, that the Foundation would be launching an immediate investigation into any research they'd funded based on the methodology paper, and that until that investigation concluded, all of Daniel's active grants would be frozen. She said that she'd also be filing a formal complaint with the journal's parent organization about the database tampering, and that she'd be recommending that all of Daniel's publications in that journal be subject to post-publication review. She said this all very calmly, very professionally, the way someone delivers a death sentence when they've made their decision and know it's the right one. Daniel finally found his voice, saying that this was all a misunderstanding, that he could explain everything if people would just listen. But no one was listening anymore, or rather, they were listening but not believing. The consensus in the room had shifted in the way these things do, suddenly and completely, from accepting Daniel's version of events to questioning everything about him. People were pulling out their phones, undoubtedly texting colleagues who weren't at the summit, spreading the news that something major was happening. The academic gossip network was already spinning up, and by tomorrow this story would be everywhere, unstoppable and uncontainable. I looked at my brother, at the man who'd stolen my work and my reputation and 4 years of my life, and I felt less satisfaction than I'd expected. He looked smaller somehow, diminished not physically but in presence, like a projection that had been exposed as an illusion. Professor Whitmore's fountain pen was still in his pocket, but it didn't look like a trophy anymore. It looked like stolen property, which was exactly what it was. I walked over to him, close enough that I could speak quietly without the whole room hearing, and I told him that I wanted the pen back. He stared at me for a moment, something that might have been genuine remorse flickering across his face, then pulled the pen from his pocket and held it out to me. His hand was shaking. I took the pen, feeling the familiar weight of it, the smooth barrel that Professor Whitmore's fingers had worn smooth over years of use. I told Daniel that I didn't hate him, which was true even though I hadn't realized it until that moment. I told him that I was disappointed and angry and hurt, but mostly I was just tired of carrying around the weight of his betrayal. I told him that whatever happened next, whether he lost everything or managed to salvage something, he'd have to live with knowing what he'd done. And I told him that I hoped someday that knowledge would matter to him, though I suspected it probably wouldn't. Then I walked away, back to where Kevin and Lisa were standing, and I let him standing there alone in a room full of people who were all suddenly looking at him differently. The afternoon keynote was canceled while the conference organizers tried to figure out what to do about the situation that had just exploded in their lunch ballroom. Catherine Werner asked if I'd be willing to meet with her and some colleagues that evening to go through all the evidence formally, and I agreed. Dean Blackwell, who'd witnessed the whole confrontation from a table near the windows, approached me as people were starting to leave the ballroom. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with an expression that might have been respect or might have been relief. Then he told me that Oxford's offer was still on the table, that if anything the way I'd handled this situation made them more confident that I was the right person for the position. He said we could discuss details later after things settled down, but he wanted me to know that I hadn't just reclaimed my research today. I'd proven something more important than authorship. I'd proven integrity under pressure, and that was what Oxford really valued. That evening, I met with Catherine and a panel of researchers she'd assembled to review Kevin's evidence. We went through everything methodically: the timeline, the server logs, the witness testimony, the database modifications. It took 3 hours, and by the end of it there was no doubt in anyone's mind about what had happened. Catherine told me that the Foundation would be issuing a formal statement within 48 hours acknowledging that there had been serious irregularities in how my research had been credited, and that they'd be working with Boston University and the Journal of Applied Linguistics to correct the academic record. She couldn't undo 4 years of injustice, but she could make sure that going forward, the truth would be official and public and impossible to ignore. When I finally got back to my hotel room, it was after 10 at night and I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. I sat on the edge of the bed still wearing my suit, holding Professor Whitmore's pen in my hands and thinking about everything that had happened since that morning. My phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, former colleagues reaching out to say they'd always believed me, people who'd been silent during my exile suddenly eager to be associated with my vindication. I didn't have the energy to respond to any of them yet. I just sat there in the quiet hotel room, watching the lights of Cambridge through the window and feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it, the sense that the weight I'd been carrying might finally be lifting. The next morning, I woke to an email from Boston University's president formally apologizing for the way my case had been handled and inviting me to discuss restoring my research affiliation with the institution. Another email from the Journal of Applied Linguistics announced that they were retracting Daniel's paper and would be publishing a correction acknowledging my authorship of the methodology. A third email from Dean Blackwell contained a formal offer letter for the endowed chair position at Oxford, with a salary that was more than double what I'd been making at the tutoring center, and a research budget that would let me pursue any project I wanted. I read through all of them twice, making sure they were real, that this wasn't some elaborate dream I'd wake up from to find myself still in Portland grading SD practice tests. But it was real. It was all real. The academic world that had erased me was now scrambling to restore me. Institutions that had been silent during my exile suddenly eager to claim association with my vindication. There was irony in that, maybe even injustice of a different kind, but I was too tired to be angry about it. I'd spent 4 years being angry, and it hadn't changed anything. What had changed things was evidence and patience and the willingness to wait for the right moment, exactly like Professor Whitmore had told me to do in that letter I'd been carrying in my bag. I flew back to Portland that afternoon, but I knew I wouldn't be staying long. There were arrangements to make, a tutoring center to give notice to, an apartment to pack up, a life to dismantle so I could build a new one. Oxford wanted me to start in January, which gave me about 6 weeks to wrap up everything in Portland and prepare for the move to England. It felt impossibly fast and also like it had taken forever. 4 years of waiting compressed into a few weeks of action. On the plane, I pulled out Professor Whitmore's pen and wrote a letter to her on a paper napkin, knowing she'd never read it but needing to write it anyway. I told her that I'd finally done what she'd asked, that I'd trusted the timing and let the truth carry its own weight. I told her that I was going to Oxford, that I was going to keep working on the methodology we developed together, that her name would be on every paper I published from now on because she'd earned that recognition even if no one could give it to her anymore. I told her thank you and I'm sorry it took so long and I hope you'd be proud. When I got back to my apartment in Portland, everything looked exactly the same as when I'd left it 3 days earlier. But somehow it all felt different now, like I was seeing it from a distance, like it was already becoming part of my past rather than my present. I made tea and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd read Dean Blackwell's first email, where I'd made the decision to go to Cambridge and reclaim what had been taken from me. My phone rang and when I answered, it was Daniel. We hadn't spoken since the confrontation at the summit, and I almost didn't pick up, but something made me answer on the 4th ring. His voice was quiet, stripped of all the confidence and charm he usually carried. He said he was calling to apologize, that he knew it didn't fix anything but he needed to say it anyway. He said that he'd been jealous of me for years, of the way Professor Whitmore had believed in my work, of the natural talent I had that he'd always had to work so much harder to approximate. He said that taking my research had felt justified at the time, like he was just claiming recognition he deserved, but that he understood now what he'd actually done. He'd destroyed something that mattered and he was sorry. I listened to all of this without interrupting, and when he finished, I told him the truth. I told him that his apology didn't change what he'd done, didn't undo 4 years of exile and humiliation and grief. But I also told him that I accepted it, not because he deserved forgiveness but because I deserved to stop carrying around the weight of his betrayal. I told him that I hoped he'd find a way to rebuild his life into something honest, something he'd earned rather than stolen, but that I wouldn't be part of that process. And then I told him goodbye, and I meant it as a final thing, a door closing on a chapter of my life that I was ready to leave behind. The weeks that followed were busy with logistics and paperwork, visa applications and shipping arrangements, emails back and forth with Oxford about courses I'd teach and research projects I'd lead. I gave my notice at the tutoring center, and the kids I'd been working with threw me a small goodbye party with grocery store cake and a card they'd all signed. Sophie, the girl whose reading scores I'd helped improve, told me she'd always known I was too smart to just be a tutor, and I laughed and told her that teaching was never about what you were too smart for, it was about what you cared enough to do well. On my last day in Portland, I drove out to the coast and stood on the beach watching the waves come in. Cold December wind cutting through my jacket. I thought about Professor Whitmore, about everything she'd taught me, about how she'd been right that truth has weight and eventually that weight wins. I thought about Daniel, about the life he'd have to build now without the stolen foundation he'd been standing on. And I thought about myself, about the person I'd been 4 years ago and the person I was now, about what I'd lost and what I'd learned and what I was about to become. Oxford was everything I'd hoped it would be. Ancient stone buildings and libraries that smelled like old paper and colleagues who took ideas seriously. The endowed chair came with an office that had windows overlooking a courtyard where students gathered between classes, and on my desk, in the place of honor, I kept Professor Whitmore's fountain pen and the letter she'd written me in those final weeks. I used the pen to annotate manuscripts and write feedback on student papers and draft new research proposals that built on the methodology we developed together. My first publication from Oxford was co-authored with her posthumously, acknowledging her contribution to the theoretical framework even though she hadn't lived to see it completed. It felt right, like a debt being paid, like justice arriving late but arriving nonetheless. Sometimes students would ask me about the gap in my CV, the 4 years between my postdoc and my position at Oxford where I'd apparently done nothing but tutor high school students. I'd tell them the story, or at least parts of it, about research being stolen and the long fight to reclaim it, about patience and evidence and waiting for the right moment. I'd tell them that setbacks don't define you unless you let them, that integrity matters more than success, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to give up on the truth. They'd listen with the kind of attention students give to stories that feel real rather than theoretical, and sometimes I'd see in their faces the understanding that academic life wasn't always fair, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth fighting for. Years later, long after the scandal had faded from immediate memory and become just another cautionary tale people told about research ethics, I received a letter from Daniel. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, postmarked from a city I didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, handwritten in the careful script he'd always used when he wanted to be taken seriously. He wrote that he'd left academic life entirely, that he was teaching at a community college now under circumstances he didn't elaborate on. He wrote that he thought about what he'd done often, that the weight of it hadn't diminished with time the way he'd hoped it would. He wrote that he'd seen news of my latest publication, recognized the methodology even though I'd refined and extended it far beyond where he'd left it, and felt something that was equal parts pride and shame. He wrote that he knew I probably didn't want to hear from him, but he needed me to know that I'd been right about everything, and that he was trying, however imperfectly, to build something honest with what remained of his career. I read the letter twice, then filed it away in a drawer with other artifacts from that period of my life. I didn't respond, didn't feel the need to grant him absolution or closure or whatever he was seeking. Some wounds heal but the scars remain, and that's just how things are. What mattered was that I'd survived, that I'd reclaimed not just my research but my sense of myself as someone who could be trusted, someone whose word carried weight, someone who did work that mattered. The rest was just details, the inevitable messiness of human relationships and professional rivalries, and all the small betrayals that mark any life lived among other people. On quiet evenings in Oxford, when the work was done and the students had gone home and the only sound was the ancient heating system clicking in the walls, I'd sit at my desk with Professor Whitmore's pen in my hand and feel grateful for the long path that had brought me here. Not grateful for the suffering, not grateful for the theft or the exile or the years of doubt and struggle, but grateful for the lesson that had come through all of it. The lesson that truth does have weight, that patience is a form of power, and that justice, when it finally arrives, is worth every moment you spent waiting for it. My family had mocked my education, had treated my research as something that could be stolen and sold without consequence. Then Oxford called about an endowed chair position, and everything they dismissed as worthless became the foundation of a career they could never touch again. That was vindication enough, more than enough, A quiet victory that didn't need to be shouted to be real. The first semester at Oxford passed in a blur of lectures and seminars, faculty meetings and research proposals, the steady rhythm of academic life that I'd been locked out of for so long. Winter gave way to spring, and the courtyards filled with students sprawled on the grass with their textbooks, punting on the river, living the kind of privileged existence that felt both foreign and familiar. I'd been one of them once, young and convinced that intelligence and hard work were sufficient shields against injustice. Now I knew better, but I also knew that cynicism was its own kind of trap. You could acknowledge that the world was unfair without letting that unfairness define how you moved through it. My research was progressing faster than I'd anticipated. The methodology I developed had applications I hadn't fully explored during those early years in Boston, ways of analyzing not just ancient texts but any translated material, looking for patterns that revealed bias or intention or the subtle ways meaning shifted across languages. I'd started collaborating with a professor in the history department who specialized in colonial documents, examining how British officials had translated indigenous languages in ways that served imperial interests. It was fascinating work, the kind that made hours disappear while you were immersed in it, and it reminded me why I'd chosen this field in the first place. Language was power, and understanding how language worked meant understanding how power moved through the world. The students in my graduate seminar were sharp and engaged, asking questions that pushed me to think more carefully about assumptions I'd stopped examining. There was a young woman from Singapore named Priya who wanted to apply the methodology to corporate communications, analyzing how multinational companies adapted their messaging across different cultural contexts. There was a man from Brazil named Ricardo who was interested in literary translation, and how poets tried to carry meaning across linguistic boundaries that sometimes seemed unbridgeable. They were both brilliant in different ways, and working with them felt like a gift, like I was finally doing what I was supposed to have been doing all along. But there were also moments, usually late at night when I was working alone in my office, when I'd think about Daniel and wonder what his life looked like now. I'd resisted the temptation to search for information about him online, had decided that whatever he was doing was his business and I didn't need to know. But curiosity is a stubborn thing, and one evening after a particularly long day, I typed his name into a search engine and read through the results that appeared. He'd taken a position at a community college in Arizona, teaching introductory linguistics courses. His faculty page was spare, listing only his current position and his PhD, with no mention of publications or research projects. The confident smile from his consulting firm headshots was gone, replaced by a more subdued expression that might have been humility or might have been defeat. There was an interview he'd given to a small education blog about a year after the scandal, talking about the importance of academic integrity and the mistakes he'd made early in his career. He didn't name me or discuss specifics, just spoke in vague terms about learning from failures and trying to rebuild trust. The comments section was brutal, full of people who remembered the controversy and weren't inclined to forgive. I read through the whole thing feeling a complicated mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Part of me felt satisfied that he was facing consequences, that his theft hadn't gone unpunished. But another part felt something closer to pity, recognizing that he'd destroyed his own life as much as he'd tried to destroy mine, and that he'd have to carry that knowledge forever. I closed the browser and returned to the paper I'd been writing, but the interruption had broken my concentration. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where a few students were still studying under the outdoor lights. My phone buzzed with a message from Kevin, who'd stayed in touch even though we lived on different continents now. He was asking if I'd seen the news about Dr. Preston Vale, and when I told him I hadn't, he sent me a link to an article from that morning. The Journal of Applied Linguistics had conducted a full audit of papers published during Preston's tenure as editor, and they'd found irregularities in more than a dozen submissions. Database modifications, peer review records that didn't match the original files, papers accepted despite reviewer recommendations for rejection. Preston had resigned immediately, and the journal's parent organization was conducting a formal investigation into potential fraud. The article mentioned my case as the catalyst for the audit, noting that if a graduate student researcher hadn't persisted in challenging the official narrative, none of these other problems would have come to light. It was strange seeing my name in print that way, as someone whose actions had exposed systemic corruption rather than as the person who'd been victimized by it. Kevin's message said that I should feel proud, that what I'd done had mattered beyond just my own situation, that I'd potentially saved other researchers from having their work stolen or their careers destroyed. I appreciated the sentiment, but mostly I just felt tired. Fighting for truth shouldn't have required this much effort, shouldn't have cost so many years, shouldn't have been necessary in the first place. Spring semester ended with the usual flurry of final papers and exam grading, and then suddenly it was summer and Oxford was quieter, most of the students gone home or off to internships and research positions. I'd been invited to give a keynote address at a linguistics conference in Edinburgh, my first major speaking engagement since everything that had happened. The organizers wanted me to talk about my translation methodology and its applications, but they'd also specifically requested that I address the ethical dimensions of research, that I speak about what had happened to me and what it revealed about problems in academic culture. I'd been reluctant at first, uncomfortable with the idea of turning my personal trauma into a conference presentation, but Dean Blackwell had encouraged me to accept. He said that other people needed to hear the story, needed to understand that research theft wasn't just an abstract problem but something that happened to real people and destroyed real careers. I spent 2 weeks preparing the talk, trying to find the right balance between discussing the methodology itself and addressing the personal dimensions of what had happened. I didn't want to come across as bitter or self-pitying, but I also didn't want to sanitize the story, to make it seem like everything had worked out fine in the end and therefore the injustice didn't matter. The truth was more complicated than that. Yes, I had a position at Oxford now. Yes, my research had been vindicated and my reputation restored. But I'd still lost 4 years of my career, 4 years when I should have been publishing and building on my early work and establishing myself in the field. Those years were gone, and no amount of vindication could give them back. The conference was held in a historic building in Edinburgh's Old Town, all dark wood paneling and tall windows that looked out over the city. There were maybe 300 people in the audience when I walked onto the stage, a mix of established scholars and graduate students and people from outside academia who were interested in linguistics. I could see some faces I recognized from my Boston days, colleagues who'd been silent during my exile, and were now presumably here out of curiosity or guilt or genuine interest in the work. I set Professor Whitmore's pen on the podium in front of me, a talisman and a reminder, and began to speak. I started with the methodology itself, explaining how it worked and what problems it solved, showing examples of analyses that had revealed translation biases in historical documents. The audience was attentive, taking notes and nodding at key points, the kind of engaged response every speaker hopes for. Then I shifted to discussing how the methodology had been developed, talking about Professor Whitmore's role as my mentor and the collaborative process of refining the approach through numerous iterations. And then taking a breath, I told them what had happened next. How the research had been stolen. How I tried to fight back and been destroyed for it. How I'd spent 4 years in exile believing my career was over. How evidence and patience and the support of a few people who believed in truth had finally vindicated me. The room was completely silent as I spoke, the kind of focused attention that meant people were truly listening rather than just waiting for their turn to talk. I told them about the weight of being disbelieved, about how institutional power protects itself by destroying credibility, rather than examining evidence, about how exhausting it is to keep fighting when every system seems designed to make you give up. I told them about the moment at the summit when everything had finally shifted, when the truth had become impossible to ignore, and the people who'd supported the lie had scrambled to distance themselves from it. And I told them what I'd learned from all of it, the lessons that had come at such tremendous cost but were maybe the most valuable things I'd ever understood. I told them that truth does have weight, but weight alone isn't sufficient. Truth needs voices willing to speak it, evidence to support it, and people brave enough to listen even when listening is uncomfortable. I told them that integrity matters more than success, that being able to look at yourself without shame is worth more than any accolade or position or publication record. And I told them that if they ever found themselves in a situation like mine, if their work was stolen or their credibility attacked or their career threatened for doing the right thing, they should remember that survival is its own kind of victory and that justice delayed is still justice worth fighting for. When I finished, the applause was immediate and sustained, people standing up one by one until the whole room was on their feet. I stood at the podium feeling overwhelmed, not by the applause itself but by what it represented, by the acknowledgement that what I'd been through mattered and that people understood why it mattered. During the question and answer session that followed, Person after person stood up to share their own stories of research theft or academic betrayal, describing situations they'd never spoken about publicly before. A senior professor from Cambridge talked about having her early work plagiarized by her dissertation advisor. A graduate student from Toronto described watching a colleague claim credit for ideas she'd developed. An independent researcher from Kenya explained how Western academics routinely published work based on indigenous knowledge without proper attribution or compensation. The stories kept coming, each one a variation on the same theme of power being used to steal credit and silence victims. It was simultaneously validating and heartbreaking. This accumulation of injustices that everyone had been carrying alone, thinking their situation was unique when really it was part of a much larger pattern. After the formal session ended, people came up to talk to me individually, to thank me for speaking out, to ask advice about their own situations, to simply share space with someone who understood what they'd been through. I stayed until the venue staff started turning off lights, until every person who wanted to talk had been heard, because I knew what it meant to need that kind of witness, that acknowledgement that your experience was real and mattered. That evening, I had dinner with Dean Blackwell and several other Oxford faculty members at a restaurant overlooking Edinburgh Castle. The conversation ranged across various topics, from university politics to research trends to the best places to find authentic Scottish whiskey, but eventually it circled back to my keynote. One of my colleagues, a linguistics professor named Dr. James Thornton, said that he'd been moved by my honesty and by my willingness to discuss the personal costs of the situation, rather than just presenting it as a professional dispute. He said that academia had a tendency to treat these conflicts as abstract ethical problems, rather than recognizing the human damage they caused, and that my talk had challenged people to think more carefully about their complicity in systems that enabled theft and protected thieves. Dean Blackwell added that he'd received several inquiries from other universities about establishing similar endowed positions, focused on supporting scholars who'd faced professional setbacks due to ethical disputes. My case had apparently highlighted a gap in how institutions handled situations where talented researchers were driven out by more powerful colleagues, and there was growing recognition that academia was losing valuable voices by failing to protect people who challenged misconduct. It was gratifying to hear, though I couldn't help noting the irony that institutions were now eager to support researchers like me after one of them had already succeeded in rebuilding her career elsewhere. Where had this concern been 4 years ago when I was filling out applications for tutoring positions and trying to figure out how to survive? But perhaps that was too cynical. Change happened slowly in institutions, often only after individual cases became impossible to ignore. If my experience led to better protections for future researchers, if it made it slightly harder for people like Daniel to steal work and destroy careers, then maybe the 4 years I'd lost weren't entirely wasted. They'd been the price of learning lessons that I could now teach others, the cost of understanding systems well enough to change them. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself when I was a graduate student with dreams of making important discoveries and building a distinguished career, but it was perhaps a more meaningful life than that would have been. Understanding how to survive injustice and help others do the same might matter more than any individual research contribution I could make. The summer months passed quickly, filled with research and writing and occasional travel to conferences and seminars. I'd been invited to join an advisory board for a new academic integrity organization that was developing guidelines for how universities should handle allegations of research theft. The work was tedious but important, hours spent debating policy language and procedural details, trying to build systems that would protect victims without being vulnerable to false accusations. It was harder than I'd expected, balancing the need for swift action against the need for thorough investigation, acknowledging that some situations were genuinely ambiguous, while also recognizing that ambiguity was often weaponized to protect the powerful. But we made progress, and by the end of summer we'd produced a draft framework that several universities had agreed to pilot. In August, I received an unexpected email from someone whose name I didn't recognize, a professor at a small liberal arts college in Ohio. She'd heard my Edinburgh keynote and wanted to tell me about one of her students, a bright young woman who discovered that another student had plagiarized her honors thesis and submitted it to a major competition under his own name. The university had investigated and confirmed the plagiarism, but they'd handled it quietly, giving the male student a failing grade in the course while doing nothing to recognize that the young woman's work had won the competition it was stolen for. The professor said her student was devastated, considering dropping out entirely, and she wondered if I might be willing to speak with her, to share my experience and maybe provide some perspective on how to move forward. I agreed immediately, and we set up a video call for the following week. The student's name was Emily, and when she appeared on my screen she looked exactly how I remembered feeling 4 years ago. Exhausted and angry and profoundly disillusioned with institutions she'd been raised to trust. We talked for over an hour, and I told her my story in more detail than I'd shared publicly, including the darkest moments when I'd seriously considered giving up on academia entirely. I told her that the pain she was feeling was real and valid, that being betrayed by institutions that claimed to value integrity was genuinely traumatic, and that she shouldn't feel weak or oversensitive for struggling with it. But I also told her that she had a choice about what came next, that she could let this define her or she could survive it and build something meaningful from the experience. I told her that the most important thing was to keep doing the work she cared about, to not let someone else's theft convince her that her contributions didn't matter. I told her to document everything, to maintain relationships with people who believed in her, and to be patient with herself when the anger and grief became overwhelming. And I told her that she was stronger than she thought, that the fact that she was still fighting rather than giving up meant she had the resilience to get through this. When we finished talking, she said she felt better than she had in weeks, not because anything about her situation had changed, but because she finally felt like someone understood what she was going through and believed she could survive it. After we disconnected, I sat at my desk thinking about how many Emilis there probably were, how many students and junior researchers and untenured faculty members were going through similar experiences right now, most of them in isolation, most of them convinced their situation was unique. The problem was so much bigger than my individual case, so deeply embedded in how academic institutions function that no single person could fix it. But maybe what I could do was make sure that people who went through this knew they weren't alone, that there was a path forward even when everything seemed destroyed, that survival was possible and maybe even victory if you could hold on long enough. Fall semester began with the usual surge of activity, new students arriving, courses starting, the rhythm of academic life reasserting itself. I'd been asked to teach an undergraduate course on linguistics and social justice, examining how language was used to maintain or challenge power structures. It was outside my usual area of focus, but I'd agreed because I thought it was important, because I'd learned firsthand how language and power intersected and wanted to share those insights with students who might use them to build a more equitable world. The class was larger than expected, over-enrolled by 20 students who sat on the floor because there weren't enough chairs, all of them eager to discuss ideas about language and identity and systemic oppression. One afternoon in late September, I was in my office preparing for a seminar when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer, and I heard a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. It was Daniel. His tone was hesitant, apologetic, asking if I had a few minutes to talk or if he should call back another time. I almost told him not to call back, that we'd said everything that needed to be said, but curiosity won out and I told him I could spare a few minutes. He said he'd been following my career from a distance, reading my publications and watching videos of conference presentations online. He said he was genuinely happy for my success, that seeing me at Oxford doing important work made him feel like maybe he hadn't completely destroyed something irreplaceable, that the research he'd stolen had ultimately survived and thrived even if his theft had nearly killed it. He said he wanted me to know that he thought about what he'd done every single day, that there was no moment of success or happiness that wasn't shadowed by the knowledge of how he'd built his early career. He tried to move forward, tried to be a better person and teacher, but he couldn't escape the weight of it. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished, I told him something I'd only recently come to understand myself. I told him that his guilt wasn't my responsibility, that I'd forgiven him not because he deserved forgiveness but because carrying anger was exhausting and I'd chosen to set it down. I told him that what he did with that forgiveness was his business, that he could use it as permission to move on or he could let it motivate him to do better going forward, but either way it was his choice to make. And I told him that I hoped he found peace eventually, but that I couldn't help him find it, that this was something he'd have to work through on his own. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he thanked me in a voice that sounded close to tears. He said he didn't deserve my generosity but he was grateful for it, and then he said goodbye. I hung up feeling lighter somehow, like I'd closed a door that had been hanging open for too long. Whatever relationship Daniel and I had once had as siblings was gone, destroyed by his choices and my refusal to pretend those choices didn't matter. But maybe that was okay. Maybe some relationships weren't meant to survive, and trying to preserve them did more damage than letting them end. That winter, Oxford's Endowed Chair Committee asked me to give a public lecture about my research for prospective students and donors. It was a high-profile event, held in one of the university's historic lecture halls, with several hundred people in attendance, including members of Oxford's governing board and representatives from foundations that funded academic research. I decided to structure the talk around the concept of translation as an act of interpretation, examining how every choice a translator makes reveals assumptions about meaning and power, and whose voices deserve to be heard. I used examples from colonial documents, from religious texts, from contemporary corporate communications, showing how the same principles applied across vastly different contexts. But I also wove in my own story, talking about how my research had been mistranslated by someone who claimed to speak for me, how my voice had been appropriated and distorted in ways that served someone else's interests. I talked about the years I'd spent trying to retranslate my own work, to restore the original meaning that had been corrupted, and about what that process had taught me about resilience and patience and the stubborn persistence of truth. The lecture was well received, and afterward several students came up to tell me that they'd chosen to study at Oxford specifically because of my work, that they wanted to learn from someone who understood not just the technical aspects of linguistics but also its ethical dimensions. One young woman, a first-year student from South Africa, told me that she'd read about my case when she was in high school, and it had inspired her to speak up when she witnessed plagiarism in her own school. She'd been punished for it initially, accused of causing trouble and disrupting a successful student's future, but eventually the truth had come out and the plagiarist had been expelled. She said that knowing my story had given her the courage to keep fighting, even when everyone told her to let it go, and that she wanted to thank me for being public about what I'd been through because it had mattered more than I probably realized. I stood in that historic lecture hall, talking with students who saw my experience as meaningful rather than shameful, and I felt something shift inside me. For 4 years, what had happened with Daniel had been the worst thing in my life, the defining trauma that colored everything else. But standing there, hearing how my refusal to stay silent had helped other people find their own voices, it started to feel like something different. Not a blessing, certainly not that, but perhaps a responsibility that I'd been given whether I wanted it or not. The responsibility to speak truth even when speaking was dangerous, to challenge injustice even when challenging seemed futile, to keep showing up and doing the work because other people needed to see that survival was possible. The academic year continued with its familiar rhythms, and I settled into Oxford life more fully than I'd expected to. I bought a small flat near the university, filled it with books and comfortable furniture, and the kind of personal touches that transform a space from temporary housing into an actual home. I developed friendships with colleagues, started attending weekly dinners with a group of faculty members who gathered to discuss everything from research challenges to university politics to the best techniques for growing tomatoes in England's unpredictable climate. I dated briefly, though nothing serious developed, and I was surprised to find that I was okay with that I didn't need romance to feel like my life was complete. On the anniversary of that conference in Cambridge, exactly 1 year after the confrontation that had changed everything, I received a package from Kevin. Inside was a framed photo he'd taken at the summit without me knowing, capturing the moment right after Catherine Werner had announced the investigation into Daniel's work. In the photo, I was standing with Lisa and Marcus, the graduate students who'd testified on my behalf, and my expression was one I barely recognized. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something quieter and more profound. Relief, maybe, or perhaps simply the exhaustion that comes after a long battle when you finally realize you've won. Kevin had included a note saying that he'd kept the photo private until now because he wanted me to have some distance before seeing it, wanted me to be able to look at it without all the raw emotion of that day flooding back. He said he hoped I could see in the image what he'd seen in that moment, someone who'd been beaten down by injustice but had refused to stay down, someone who'd fought not because victory was guaranteed, but because fighting was the only choice that let her keep her integrity intact. He said he was proud to call me a friend and that he hoped I was proud of what I'd accomplished. I put the photo on my office wall, next to Professor Whitmore's letter and my doctorate diploma, and a growing collection of artifacts that represented different chapters of my life. Students would sometimes ask about it, curious about the story behind the image, and I'd give them the abbreviated version, the highlights without the full emotional weight. But occasionally a student would look at the photo and then at me, and I'd see understanding dawn in their expression, recognition that the person in the picture had been through something difficult and come out the other side. Those moments of recognition felt important, felt like part of why I was supposed to be here doing this work. 3 years after joining Oxford's faculty, I was asked to serve on a university committee reviewing policies around research misconduct. It was the kind of administrative work that most faculty members tried to avoid, time-consuming and often frustrating, but I accepted because I knew my perspective was valuable, that I understood dimensions of these issues that people who'd never been victimized couldn't fully grasp. We spent months reviewing case studies and drafting new procedures, arguing about burden of proof and appropriate penalties, and how to balance protecting accusers against protecting the accused. It was exhausting work, but by the time we finished, Oxford had one of the most comprehensive research integrity policies in British higher education, with clear procedures for investigating allegations and strong protections for whistleblowers. The policy's implementation wasn't perfect. There were cases that fell through cracks, situations where institutional interests still seemed to outweigh pursuit of truth, moments when I was reminded that changing systems was infinitely harder than changing individual behaviors. But there were also victories, cases where junior researchers who'd been plagiarized received proper credit, where powerful professors who'd stolen work faced real consequences, where the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. Each small victory felt significant, felt like incremental progress toward a version of academia that lived up to its stated values of integrity and truth-seeking. My research continued to evolve, expanding beyond the original translation methodology into broader questions about how language shapes understanding and how power determines whose interpretations get treated as authoritative. I published a book that examined translation practices in international law, showing how choices about language affected everything from human rights protections to environmental regulations. The book was well received, reviewed positively in major journals and assigned in graduate seminars around the world. It felt strange seeing my work cited and discussed, knowing that a few years earlier I'd been tutoring teenagers for SAT prep, and wondering if I'd ever contribute to scholarly conversations again. But the strangest moment came when I received an invitation to give a keynote at a conference being organized by the Journal of Applied Linguistics, the same journal that had published Daniel's stolen research. They were celebrating their 50th anniversary, and wanted to feature speakers whose work had been influential in the field. The irony was almost too much, and my first instinct was to decline, to refuse to participate in anything connected to the journal that had enabled the theft that nearly destroyed my career. But after thinking about it for several days, I decided to accept. Not to let them off the hook, but to use the platform to talk about the changes still needed in academic publishing, the ways journals could do better at verifying authorship and detecting plagiarism and protecting researchers who challenged powerful figures. The keynote became one of the most discussed talks of the conference, not because I attacked the journal directly, but because I laid out with uncomfortable precision all the ways their systems had failed and continued to fail. I talked about how peer review often reinforced existing hierarchies rather than challenging them, how prestigious publications went disproportionately to researchers at elite institutions, how editorial boards remained dominated by people who benefited from maintaining the status quo. Some people in the audience were defensive, arguing that I was being too harsh, or that the problems I described were anomalies rather than systemic issues. But others, particularly junior scholars and people from underrepresented groups, stood up to share their own experiences of being marginalized or ignored, or having their work stolen by more powerful colleagues. The conversation continued long after the formal session ended, spilling out into hallways and continuing at dinner, and eventually leading to a petition calling for reforms in how academic journals operated. I didn't start the petition or lead the reform efforts, but I supported them however I could, lending my name and my story to a movement that was much larger than my individual case. Change came slowly, but it came. Journals started implementing better authorship verification procedures. Professional organizations developed clearer ethics guidelines. Universities began taking research misconduct allegations more seriously, recognizing that their reputations suffered when they protected wrongdoers. None of it was enough. The systems remained deeply flawed, still tilted toward protecting the powerful and silencing victims. But it was something, and something mattered when the alternative was nothing. I thought often about Emily, the student whose thesis had been plagiarized, and about all the other people whose names I didn't know who were fighting similar battles. I hoped that the changes we were making, incremental as they were, might make their fights slightly easier, might give them slightly better odds of winning. That hope sustained me through the frustrating committee meetings, and the exhausting policy debates, and the moments when progress seemed impossible. Years accumulated, each one marked by publications and presentations, by students mentored and courses taught, by the steady accumulation of a career that looked from the outside like uninterrupted success. Only I knew about the 4-year gap, the exile that wasn't visible on my CV but had shaped everything that came after. Sometimes I wondered what my life would have looked like if Daniel hadn't stolen my research, if Professor Whitmore hadn't died when she did, if the investigation had gone differently. Maybe I'd be at some other university, maybe still in Boston, with a longer publication record and more prestigious awards, but also without the hard-earned understanding that made me who I'd become. It was impossible to know, and after a while I stopped wondering. The life I had was the life that existed, and it was enough. On what would have been Professor Whitmore's 80th birthday, I organized a symposium in her honor at Oxford, bringing together scholars who'd been influenced by her work and students she'd mentored over her long career. We spent 2 days discussing her contributions to linguistics, but we also talked about her as a mentor and teacher, about her fierce commitment to her students and her willingness to challenge powerful colleagues when she believed they were wrong. Several people mentioned me, talking about how she'd believed in my work when others were skeptical, how she'd pushed me to think more rigorously and write more clearly. It was moving to hear, though also painful, a reminder of everything I'd lost when she died and couldn't defend me against Daniel's lies. At the symposium dinner, I proposed a toast using Professor Whitmore's fountain pen as a prop, holding it up so everyone could see. I told the story of how I'd lost the pen and then reclaimed it, how it had become a symbol of everything Daniel had stolen and everything I'd fought to recover. I told them that Professor Whitmore had once said that truth has weight, and that eventually weight wins, and that her wisdom had sustained me through years when weight felt like all I was carrying. I told them that she'd taught me not just linguistics but how to be a scholar with integrity, how to value truth over convenience, and how to keep fighting even when the fight seemed hopeless. And I told them that everything good in my career, everything I'd accomplished or would accomplish in the future, was built on the foundation she'd helped me create, and that I would spend the rest of my life trying to honor her legacy by being for other students what she'd been for me. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, and when people came up afterward to share their own memories of Professor Whitmore, several mentioned that she would have been proud of me, that she'd always known I had the strength to overcome whatever obstacles appeared. I wanted to believe that, wanted to think that somewhere she knew what had happened and approved of how I'd handled it. But even if she didn't, even if death meant the end of consciousness and there was no afterlife where she could observe my vindication, I knew that I'd lived according to principles she'd taught me. That had to be enough. The career I'd built after Oxford became the career I'd always imagined having, the one that had been interrupted but not destroyed by Daniel's theft. I received awards and honors, got invited to give prestigious lectures, saw my work cited and built upon by other scholars. But the work I was most proud of wasn't the research itself. It was the students I'd mentored who went on to do important work of their own, the policies I'd helped implement that protected vulnerable researchers, the times I'd spoken up about injustice, even when speaking up was uncomfortable or risky. Professor Whitmore had taught me that scholarship mattered not just for its own sake, but for how it contributed to building a more just world. I'd learned that lesson the hard way, through years of exile and struggle, but I'd learned it completely. And now I was teaching it to others, passing on the knowledge that had been so painfully acquired. My family had mocked my education, had treated my research as worthless, had believed that power and connections mattered more than integrity or truth. Then Oxford called about an endowed chair position, and everything they dismissed became the foundation of a life they could never diminish again. That vindication wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and steady, built day by day through good work and ethical choices and refusing to let injustice have the final word. It was waking up each morning in a city I loved, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who valued truth and integrity. It was knowing that I'd survived something that could have destroyed me and come out stronger on the other side. It was looking at Professor Whitmore's fountain pen on my desk and knowing that I'd honored her memory by refusing to give up, by trusting that truth did have weight and that eventually, if you could hold on long enough, weight would win. Justice had arrived late, years after I'd almost stopped believing it would come at all. But it had arrived, and that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.